Welcome back to the Disrupt Education Podcast. What's up, tandem trainer Allie? Is that how you do it? You're training skydivers now. Tell us about
Yes,
that.
I am an official tandem skydiving instructor. So, and
Wow.
and a solo skydiving instructor. So whether somebody wants to go on however someone wants to go on their first skydive, I can make that happen now. I wanted like all of the ratings, so that I could be accessible to people who, whatever wherever they wanted to
Yeah.
kind of plug into the sport. And in a like other news related to the sport, I'm actually in my first demo skydive at an air show,
Nice.
which is
Wow.
really exciting. This will come out after, but I want to do it next year. It's called the Osceola Wheels and Wings. It's in Wisconsin. It's right on the border, like of Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's a beautiful air show. And if you look it up, you can see all the cool stuff. I think the plane stuff is cooler than the skydiving stuff, but it's probably because I don't do that stuff. But yep.
Awesome. Well,
Big.
congratulations on that. That is amazing news. Honestly, I love the way that you're taking teaching and education beyond and going into what you really love to do. And that kind of brings us to our guest today. We have the amazing Christine Cruzvergara here. She is the Chief Education Strategy Officer at Handshake, which is the largest platform for Gen Z talent. Now, whenever I say Gen Z talent, Christine, people's ears pluck up. They're like, wait, what? They're either like, we got to teach these kids, or there's an there's a talent that is kind of unrevealed yet, I guess
Mm.
is it. I don't know if that's even a word. That's my Gen X word, unrevealed. But welcome, Christine. Thank you for being here. And that was kind of a quick kind of intro, if you will. Can you give us kind of a little bit more deeper intro on who you are and what you're up to?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Excited to be here. As you mentioned, Christine, I'm the Chief Education Strategy Officer at Handshake, which essentially means that I help to run our education side of the business. At Handshake, we partner with over 1,500 universities and colleges across the nation, both 4-year as well as 2-year, private and public, large and small, elite and non-elite, kind of you name it, we have it. And we work really closely, in particular, with our EDU partners to ensure that we're helping support them on a shared mission, which is we want all of our students to be able to have great outcomes, whatever that might be for the student. So both their internship as well as their first job. And now at Handshake, we're even growing with the student, and we're helping a lot of returners come get their second job or their third job or their fourth job even. So it's exciting to sort of do that work. And prior to my time at Handshake, I spent the whole first decade or so of my career working in higher education.
Mhm.
I worked at all of the Georges in the DC area, so GW, Georgetown, and George Mason. And when I ran out of Georges, I went up to Boston and I served as the associate provost at Wellesley College up there, where career education was also part of my portfolio. And I think the one major thread or theme through my entire career is that it's always been about change management
Hmm.
and really helping to get folks that maybe have differing perspectives or agendas kind of aligned on a shared vision of what we might be able to do more powerfully together.
So what I love is that you've seen a lot, especially in secondary, post-secondary education areas. And the company is around 10 years old, if I'm
Right.
correct.
Mhm.
Did a little bit of my homework here, Allie. Reading your bio, first generation college student, correct?
Yeah.
So going through that, like why careers in education? It was always academics, right? When I went through, kind of back in the 90s, I'm gonna date myself. It was like get the degree and then you'll be okay. Um, where was it? Where was the turn where you started to see, hey, we need to connect this to more skill sets and careers and getting people out there outside of a classroom in I don't know what people would say, the real world, if you will, in
Yeah.
the world of work, I should say, in that connection. Where did that spark come from?
Yeah. So I think if I really think about it, for me, education was never separate from career.
Mm.
It was never one or the other. And it was never this notion of like, you're just going to college to go to college and then to graduate. It was always, you're going to college because this is the way to have a better life. And that was at least the way that my parents, as immigrants to the States, had always talked about it. Like, you have to go to college, you have to do this, because the only way for you to live a better life, to have an easier life than we did, is to get an education. And nobody can take that education away from you. And so for me, I think growing up, it was always linked. It was always connected. And as I started working in higher education, for me, I originally started off in new student orientation. That was actually my first love in higher ed. And I loved working with sort of the cream of the crop, the leaders of all of these different institutions. And it was amazing to develop them and to see that growth over the course of the year as you worked with them. But when I transitioned into career services, what I realized, what really hit me was, for all of these students that I'm meeting with, a huge portion of them will never interact with a single administrator in their entire time at college. Outside of their faculty member, they'll never interact with another administrator. And I have the privilege and the honor of actually helping them with a decision that they will remember for the rest of their lives. And if I do this well, I will hopefully help shape part of that experience that they have and that memory that they have. And I sort of felt like the weight of that was really important. And so anyhow, I fell in love with career services and actually helping people make this decision at such a pivotal point in their life. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I guess I really like transition points, right? Orientation is about high school to college, career is about college to career. And so I enjoy that decision-making process and helping people gain more clarity around that notion. And then as my career grew and I ended up leading different teams and doing different things at the institution, I realized that the better leader I could be, the more I could actually help unblock and scale my reach to more and more students. So for me, it's always been one and the same.
So many people, nowadays question that statement, right? Like, you need college in order to be successful. And, looking at the work that Handshake does, I mean, I love the mission is, helping every student find meaningful career, regardless of where they went to school or who they know, right? Like, I think to the kind of the two different high schools that I worked at, one was more rural, working class students, and they could go work in like the town where their family was, but the options maybe were limited, versus the second high school that I taught at, more well-to-do, suburban, high on the socioeconomic status. And a lot of the students would come in and they'd be like, oh, well, I'm just going to go work for mom and dad. It's like company or, wherever they were at. It was kind of like already locked and loaded. They just needed to check the box. They didn't really have to work for it. And that mentality. I was ending my teaching career kind of as this, I feel like this big shift with Gen Z happening of like, do I really need to go to college? So it's interesting that the work that Handshake does is partnering with 1,500 colleges and universities. It's amazing. Like, my question is, how do you get that buy-in at Handshake that really, you know what I mean? Like, if that is the mission, like, how does Handshake help universities like meet that need to show like, look, like college can really help you forward, when that's a question mark in many people's minds? Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different layers. So my first thing is I fundamentally still believe that education is a game changer. I still think that education can 100% help you if you want social mobility, if you want a better job, if you want to just, quite frankly, grow as a person. I still heavily believe in education. Now, what I also believe is that there are multiple forms of education that should be accepted by society. And I think that is what has started to shift. I think you don't just have to have a 4-year degree. I don't think that 4-year degree has to be from the most elite institutions. I think you could have a 2-year degree. I think you could choose to go to trade school. I think you could choose to get a certificate. I think there's a number of different ways that we can think about education, but I fundamentally believe in education. So for me, when people question, well, what's really the value of education? I think the question really is, what's the value of which type of education? And are you really looking at it from a cost perspective, right? So if I'm going to pay $70,000, I need to be able to get X type of return out of that versus do you have that same expectation if you're only spending $10,000? Or you're only spending five? Like, what's your threshold? And the reality is that's so personal. Every family, every student has a different threshold for where if this were free, or if this were a couple thousand, or if this were 5,000, or if this were 10,000, or there's 15,000, I now have a varying degree of expectation that comes along with that. And I think part of that is based on your upbringing. It's based on your own SES. It's based on what you've seen around you. And there's no one right answer. It's just simply dependent on sort of your context. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece, though, for me is because we partner with so many different types of institutions, it is imperative for us that we are working hand in hand with the entity that actually has so much student affiliation and student affinity. When you talk to any given student, most of the time, they have a lot of affinity for where they go to school, because they've discovered a community, they feel belonging, they have mentors or faculty or coaches or people that simply believe in them and have given them some level of advice. And so for us, it feels silly not to tap into a trusted network of individuals that have already tapped into the lives of many of our students. Why would we not partner with them to do the work that both of us want to do? We both want to see the students be successful. We simply have one set of strengths and our schools have a different set of strengths. And if we can actually bring those together, we can be more effective in the work overall.
My mind is blown right now because I really love to hear the fact that, we're looking at types of education. And then to hear you say that at the level that you are is something that I think that's the big change. I see it at the secondary level. I even see it at the primary level of the attitudes and the thought processes through what is education. It's a great question. The equitable piece of this is what I really, really like. Can you kind of talk a little bit about how have you seen Handshake and the different things that are done within the company to help people network across all types of educational platform or educational entities, companies? How do you see that in equity working together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think equity has actually always been at the core of our mission, right? Democratizing opportunity was why Handshake even grew to exist and is still very much at the core of how we do a lot of our work. And actually, if I go back really quick to your previous question, Peter, I think one of the things that is really wonderful is there's greater acceptance from employers now about the different types of education. We're really starting to see a lot of employers, for example, look at two-year institutions and community college students in a way that they never did before. And not just for like super basic roles, but for similar white collar jobs that historically were only available to bachelor students. We've seen upwards of more than 14 states remove degree requirements for their state positions, where just a year ago or 2 years ago, they required a bachelor's, right? Like, it's really wonderful to actually see employers embrace the fact that they could get really talented students and really talented candidates from a variety of places. So anyway, that was my slight tangent.
I love it. My kid's going to a 2-year. He's grabbing an associate, so it's working.
Good to know. It's good to know. So, but to go back to your question about equity, so I think one of the biggest things that we do as a platform is we actually help provide data to school or to employers about schools and about students that help them to see the type of talent you're looking for may not be in the places that you have historically gone. And so that actually helps employers to see, okay, in the past, I maybe had a core school strategy where I went to 5 or 10 or 15 or maybe even 25 schools. And those were the primary places where I recruited. And maybe I chose those places because of geographic location. Maybe I chose them because of a specific program. Maybe I chose them simply because our most senior execs all went to some of those schools. And that's why I recruit at those schools now, right? Number of reasons. What we're able to do is actually say, hey, if you're looking for this type of student with these credentials and these skills that are willing to relocate to these locations, did you know that actually there's a pocket of them at George Mason? There's a pocket of them at UNLV. There's a pocket of them at Rutgers. There's a bunch of them at UTSA. And those might all be schools that for some employers, they've never even considered looking at. They've never even visited. They didn't even know it might exist because they didn't realize that actually that talent already exists. So we're able to use data to essentially surface to employers, your talent is more widely spread than you might think it is. So let's think about a strategy that actually allows you to be more school agnostic in how you recruit and how you think about those components. That's probably the biggest. We have lots of other little ways, but that's probably the biggest.
This whole series is all about people who are like deep in the work of disrupting education and investing in change in education. And so I just think your perspective here is so unique to that, to what we've had on the podcast, because we don't actually have a ton of higher ed partnership organizations and working strategically with, like kind of post-secondary in that realm. So your perspective here is really, really interesting. And like, I kind of just want to ask, you said in your career, you're like, okay, so I'm really passionate about, transition points and change management and bringing that all together. So how do you see, like your role at Handshake and just kind of like your background in disrupting education and like, because you are deep in the work. And so I'm just curious, like, what would you even say, like, how does your role and your work in Handshake really kind of move the needle forward of like just opening up education in new and innovative ways? Yeah.
So I think the bigger framework that I would try and like set this in context of it, as a tech company, as you all are aware, we have to evolve and change quite rapidly in order to stay nimble, to stay relevant, to stay viable, right? If we don't change at a pretty rapid pace as a tech company, you will be obsolete very, very quickly. And because our audience base is actually Gen Z, right? It is literally the newest generation of the workforce. They have a high expectation for the type of technology that they use and engage with, right? So we are essentially competing against things like Spotify and TikTok and Netflix and YouTube, right? Like consumer products that they are very used to using, that they find incredibly intuitive. If we are not at least close to being as intuitive or sticky, we don't stand a chance. They're not going to want to use us. And if they don't want to use us, we're actually of no value to our EDU partners. We're of no value to our employer partners. So we have to like rapidly change, right? So that's one piece of it. Now, you obviously, since your whole podcast is on disrupt education, one of the things that you keenly are also aware of is that education does not necessarily move at the same pace of change as tech does, right? Okay.
We've seen that.
You've seen that. Now, that being said, we believe very strongly in our three-sided marketplace. That's how we always describe ourselves. We're a three-sided marketplace. We have education partners, we have employer partners, and we have students. And we have every intention of staying a three-sided marketplace. We don't want to lose our EDU partners. We don't want to go down to just employers and students. We want to keep our education partners because we believe they add value and they're really important. So what that means is that myself and my team are actually doing a lot of change management with our EDU partners as we continue to evolve the product and who we are as a company. We're bringing them along on that change. We co-create the product with them, and we're helping them to envision a new way of doing their job and what their roles can continue to evolve into so that they can continue to be relevant and add value to all of this. Now, having worked in career services and literally been in the shoes of many of my customers, I would be the first, and many of them would not be surprised to hear me say this, we don't always change very quickly. And there's often a lot of fear associated with the change. But if we break that down, often that fear, what's really at the core is fear of the unknown, fear of not knowing if I will still be valuable. Will there be a need for me? and fear of, can I adapt fast enough to remain relevant or to remain valuable? And my message often to our partners is, if you come with us and you partner with us, we will help you get there. We will help you stay relevant. We will help you learn. We will help you adapt, but you got to meet us halfway. You got to be willing to at least be open-minded enough to do that, right? So I'll give you a couple concrete examples of how, as a company, we've actually disrupted education in a way that has actually allowed us to still partner, but truly has shifted the system. So the first one is in 2014, when Handshake first came into the market. We came into the market as a network. And that was fundamentally different at the time. All of our competitors back then were closed enterprise systems, right? So an institution would buy this system, they would white label it, it would be closed and private to just that institution. And let's say, Ali, I'm going to pick on you. I'm going to pretend like you're a recruiter at a Big Four company, and you want to recruit at multiple institutions. You now have to log into this institution system and this institution system and this institution system, so on and so forth. And you have to post your job over and over and over and over again. And what Handshake said was, there's got to be an easier way, because what's happening is that when a recruiter has to do that, they decide, you know what, I'm just going to do core schools. I'm just going to post at my top 5 or my top 10 or my top 20, because I don't have time to do this for multiple schools. It's too time consuming. And so Handshake said, you know what, we can be a network. And instead, Ali, you as the recruiter, you log into Handshake, you post your job once, and you could actually post it to all the Handshake schools or a subset of the Handshake schools with a click of a button. And now you didn't just have to log into 15, 20, 25 different systems and post the same job over and over again, right? Now, initially, when this first came into the market, I was still in higher ed at the time. And I remember the conversation and the buzz amongst many of my colleagues. There was skepticism, there was cynicism, and people were like, I don't know, if we do this, we might be losing all our employers. All my employers are going to go recruit Peter's students instead of my students. We're all going to lose. We're going to lose all our relationships, right? But the reality is, when you think about equity, it's not a zero-sum game. I know people like to think it is. Sometimes people are fearful that it is, but it's actually not. And so we were able to lift everyone up. Any school that joined Handshake actually grew not only their employer relationships, but their internship and full-time job opportunities by over 200% for the first 2 years. First year, and then the second year, often another 200%. So everybody won because of the system, because of literally how the platform worked. We disrupted the way that system sort of worked. So that's just an example. And we've had multiple examples since then, but that's like the biggest one, I think, in how we've started to change how this works. And that doesn't have to look exactly the way it always has been.
I would say 200% is a big change. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I
A
really
lot more
like.
opportunities for students. So
Right. And I think that's, something even at the secondary level that is now changing. One of the things that a lot of people that, I hang out with down here in 9 through 12, it's not really down here, I'm just saying that, but like, we're working now. A lot of the people that, we've crossed paths with, and we're building these now internship programs at the high school level are changing the game. And we're looking at different ways. There's some schools way out front on this. As you know, it's probably the same in post-secondary, and then there's some that are kind of tagging along and doing the old Titanic turn, if I may so myself. So, but I think one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is about, how have you seen, even previous to Handshake and post-secondary education, the implementation used to be, and this might be a hypothesis on my end, but used to be all the experiences would be like at master's plus level. You do an MBA, you'd have like a Big Four accounting firm come in, and then you'd work a project, da da da. What are you seeing more and more of that in the post-secondary world, where companies are coming in, and obviously you have a platform here that is allowing those connections to happen at a more efficient rate? Yeah, what kind of things have you seen change, pulling down those walls curricular wise, if you will?
Mm. I think there are more and more schools that are genuinely interested in trying to ensure some type of experiential learning for undergraduate students. So you don't have to wait until you're a master's student, MBA student to kind of get that hands-on learning. I think the whole notion of experiential learning, work-based learning, whatever you want to call it, is becoming more and more popular. I think there are even schools who historically have perhaps been known more to be focused on just academics or the purity of sort of higher education have really started to come around and saying, hey, we need to make sure that our students are getting some kind of research opportunity, some type of internship. Maybe it's a job shadow, maybe it's study abroad, but they need something that's like hands-on. And they're starting to embed it into their curriculum. Now, this takes a number of different forms. There are some schools that put it in the curriculum and it's actually credit bearing. There are others that put it in the curriculum, but it's non-credit bearing. There are others that encourage it, but it's not actually in the curriculum, but it's so much a part of the culture that pretty much everyone does it. I think you've got varying levels of commitment depending on where different institutions' cultures sort of reside. But that being said, experiential learning has been a very, very hot topic for schools and institutions. I would say over the past 5 years, it's grown quite significantly. And I think it'll be interesting to see what more gets embedded or required. I always think that's the interesting piece, is like what really tips the scale between just encouraged versus required. And how is it required? Is it required in the curriculum with credit or without? And what does that really look like? Because I think all of that sends a message to students about the importance of what it is they're doing. You also have other really great platforms out there like Riipen, for example, who actually do something called work-based learning, and they provide projects to faculty members who can bring employers and projects into the classroom. And so the student isn't going out to do an internship. They're doing a lot of that work with their own classmates within the course. So I think you have models like that too, but those are hard to scale. And so we'll be curious to see over the next few years what schools continue to do, and also how they track it, which will be a different beast in and of itself.
So you worked in higher education and then you went to a startup tech company,
Yeah.
right? Like that's pretty disruptive in itself. What what made you want to, kind of take the leap in that route in your own career? Like, just for people listening, because I don't think we've had anyone on that works in a role like yours. And it is a very unique way to partner and be like, hey, actually, this is the bridge that your institution needs to really. It doesn't seem disruptive. That's what we're learning, is that like disruption doesn't have to be like this bomb that gets like set off, but like, it's a piece of software and a tool or an app that it seems innocuous in theory, but it can have these really wide ripple effects. Well, you working in higher ed, okay, did you feel like there was, a point where you could only do so much that you had to go to another angle, or, like, just walk us through, why you made that move and how it's maybe transformed your point of view on education.
Yeah, I was not looking to necessarily make a move. I was very happy in higher ed. I was very happy at my institution, and with all of the change that I had recently led while I was at Wellesley. And so honestly, this was very opportunistic. The CEO and the COO at the time came and reached out to me and asked if I would consider this particular role. And I hadn't had that thought of like, wow, maybe I should work for a tech company. Like that had literally never crossed my mind at that moment. And what was really fascinating was as we talked more and more about the role, I realized at the very core of the role. Initially, what I was looking at was like, can I actually do these functions? I've never led a sales team. I've never led a success team. I've never led a marketing or an ops and enablement team. I've never worked with engineering. Like, could I really do the job? Could I do this role? I've never been responsible for a third of a business like before. Like, will I be able to do this? Right? Like, there's all those sort of like questions first that sort of pop into your head. But as we started talking, what I realized was, yeah, you're leading all of these teams and they have very specific functions. But part of what's at the very foundation of all of those functions is change management. And that I understand. I understand people, I understand dynamics, I understand change management, and I can learn those other pieces. So as long as they know what they're getting with me and I'm clear about where my strengths are, if we feel like that might be a good fit for where the company is at this particular moment in time, let's think about doing this together. And so I think it was both a leap of faith on both of our parts. And I think because we had identified that the change management and bringing our partners along was such a core and important piece of it, I felt confident in my ability to help move the needle. Even if I only move the needle a little bit, I would be able to impact millions of students. And I think the scale of that potential was in some ways too good to pass up. And so that was something that I needed to really like think strongly about. I think the other piece was I needed to follow some of my own advice that I had given students over the years, which was like, you can kind of do anything for a year or two, give it a shot, see how it goes. If you don't like it, you can always switch back. You could always go do something else, but you've gained some new skill set, at least one, and you can sort of figure it out from there. And then I think three, I had at the time advanced fairly quickly in my career in higher education. And I was reporting to the president, and a mentor of mine essentially asked me, do you see yourself in this role until you retire? And I was like in my early 30s at the time. And I was like, that's a hard question. That's like, I mean, that's like 30 some years. I don't know. And he goes, well, let me ask you a different question. Do you see yourself getting a PhD? Because if you potentially want to do anything else in higher ed, you might need a terminal degree. And I knew pretty definitively at that point, like, I'm not interested in getting a PhD. That is not something that I already have my master's, not interested in doing a formal PhD. And he said, I think you should really consider going for this role because it is really rare that you might get to use your subject matter expertise in a lateral role where you are able to come in and have some level of influence at the senior leadership table for a company. And if you like this, you've just opened up more doors for yourself. You could stay in tech, you could go into business, you could go into foundations, you could go back to higher ed, but you've given yourself optionality. And I didn't realize until he said that at that moment how important optionality is to me personally. And so that was ultimately what tipped the scale for me. And I decided, let's move across the country and give this new role and new industry a shot. And we'll see if I can hack it. And 5.5 years later, I am still here. So it's worked out.
I love that story because there's so many things I've heard over and over again, not only in a lot of the content that you've put out in the articles, but the skill sets, the self-actualization, the confidence level, mentorship, all these things that you're on a platform that is also like helping others see that. So there's so much synergy between your path and where you're working and what Handshake does as well. So that's just a wonderful thing. And I think Ali and I have been talking about like your why and you really hitting it and finding your why at certain times, and it might change and who knows, maybe you'll end up back on the East Coast. But all these different things that come into play, you're actually living what you're doing. And I think, one of the things that we'll pass along to educators and administrators who are listening, really like, live through what your clients, your students are doing, which is amazing. So thank you for sharing that. Wanted to wrap up here and give a moment for Ali to give a quick last second, what are your final thoughts? And then we'll collect some information for our listeners to connect with you and Handshake. So, Allie, final thoughts.
Well, we definitely don't want to wrap this conversation up
I
because
know.
it's exceptional, and the work that you're doing is super unique at Handshake, and people definitely need to check it out. I loved the part you just said that you could do anything for a year or two, and
Yeah.
I as a skydiver who got into the sport literally 2 years ago, I just took a shot at it, and it's totally transformed my life. And it sounds like Handshake and that move that probably at the time seemed wild to friends and family and to students. When you're thinking about doing something that might seem crazy to your friends and family, like, you have our permission at the podcast to give it a go, and you just don't know where it will take you. And that's the cool part about education. And I agree with you, Christine, in that it really does open doors. It gives you those options. And your story is just a testament to that.
And I realize, Allie, I never answered your second part of that question, which is I have learned more in the 5.5 years that I have been at Handshake than in my entire decade previous. And I think in large part, it's because I've been challenged and stretched in ways that I could not have imagined. And no doubt that's been hard many times. But being able to learn and get through that and to do that with the team that I have has been really remarkable. And I think the biggest lesson is that I just have a wider aperture, right? Like, I'm not looking at the issues that the three of us are talking about from just one angle or one lens. I can see it from that lens. I can see it from the lens that I sit in now. I've gotten to know some of our VCs. I can see it from their lens. I see it from the students' lens. Like, I'm able to just understand more context and more approaches to how we do things. And I think that, quite frankly, is what we need more of in our world and in our society, is the ability to not only sit with your own perspective, but to sit with the perspective of others and to recognize that one might not be wrong or right. They're just different. And sometimes if we work a little bit more cohesively together, we can actually create more win-win situations rather than this constant like either or situation.
Yes, and that's where I go with that. I love that. So, Christine, how can people connect with you and Handshake? How do people find more? Because I know
Sure.
after this podcast, they're going to want more.
Well, if you want to find Handshake, you can download the Handshake app on your phone, Android or iOS. You can also go to our website, which is joinhandshake.com. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Handshake or on LinkedIn. And so it's pretty straightforward.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christine, for giving us some time today to talk about this so important way to just kind of pull down some blockers between education and workforce. I love your stories, especially, where it was never a separation for you, academics and workforce. And I think that a lot of people who did separate them before are now changing. I can't wait to see where you go from here. From 4.5 to 5 years, what you've learned, what's the next 4 or 5 years entail. But I'm guessing probably before that, we may have you back on the Disrupt Education podcast. So thank you so much for sharing all your stories.
Thank you. It was an honor to chat with you both.
Awesome. So for you listeners, you always want to go back and pause and take notes on these. Go ahead. But we do ask, hit that subscribe button, share it out. We have some great guests continuing. We just keep going, Allie. So thank you for all you for listening. And so for Christine, Allie Privet, I'm Peter Hostrassler. We'll catch you next time on the Disrupt Education podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of the Disrupt Education podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Are you ready to disrupt the educational arena you're a part of? For more ways to get involved in the work we do here at Disrupt Education, check us out at disrupteducation.co or find us on LinkedIn at Peter Hostrassler or Allie Privet.
Our mission here is to help facilitate and amplify changes in the educational system through local initiatives and help you scale them into community movements. Our building network of disruptors in education are working to move beyond scores and grades as the only measure for student learning. If your school district, college, campus, or organization is looking for facilitators of this work, reach out on our website or social media.
And if you have any thoughts or feedback on this week's episode or any episode, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries, taking risks, and most importantly, disrupting education.